questions first. As we have time, we'll take some from the floor. And please understand that I might treat some real quickly because we're going to deal with them in greater detail tomorrow. And so I don't want to take the time to do something now we're doing tomorrow because it's redundant. Why do terrorists call us, I guess that means Americans or maybe Christians, infidels if we believe in the one God? I talked about that a little bit. The Quran really originally intends the expression infidel to be expression for those who are polytheists. Most references in the Quran regarding infidels would not refer to a Jewish person or a Christian. Okay? And I'm using the term Christian accommodatively there. Please understand. However, that's been a long time, and there are sources today that would call anybody who is not a Muslim an infidel. Okay? So it just varies. The teachings of Islam being deeply religious and political as they are, is it possible for a primarily Muslim nation to have a government with the separation of church and state? Almost impossible. It's very hard. Now, there is a difference, though, because actually many of the colonies were like this, and even some of the states were like this until the early 1800s in the United States, that you can have a government-endorsed religion. For instance, the Church of England was the official religion of England. However, there was some religious freedom. You could also be a Quaker, okay, or a Jew within England at a certain time. So even if it is a primarily Muslim nation and they endorse the religion of Islam, they may still allow freedom of religion with some limitations, or they may not. There's a spectrum here, okay, of nations that have Muslim people in them, and they have very open societies and a lot of freedoms, and they're very democratic, okay. To some extent, Turkey's like that. It's very Western in a lot of ways. And then you have more extreme ones where there's very little religious freedom, like Saudi Arabia. There's very little religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. And if you're a Saudi, there's virtually none, okay? If you're a visitor, they're more, lax with that. So if it's dominated by Islam, it is hard to have, a separation of church and state. Are all three monotheistic religions sons of Abraham? Comments. In a way, yes. From a historical standpoint, Jews could say they're descendants of Abraham. They are racially and culturally descendant of Abraham. Christians claim descent from Abraham in a spiritual way through faith. And Muslims can claim a connection to Abraham, sons of Abraham, through Ishmael. And I think that's true. I mean, that's an accurate way to put all that. Muhammad's calling, did anyone witness this? Or could it have been his own imagination? How was he able to convince others he was indeed a prophet? What was the appeal of the teaching? That's an excellent question. And this is the kind of question that's at the heart of all this. I'll be glad to talk about multiple wives here in a moment, but there are some issues that are certainly less germane than others. But is he a prophet of God? There were no witnesses. The answer to the first question, there were no witnesses. None. Okay? So how did he prove he was a prophet? That's what we're going to talk about tomorrow afternoon. What were the evidences that he offered that I'm the prophet of God? And especially comparing that to Jesus and what he said was the evidence that he was a prophet of God. In the people who preached the name of Jesus, like in the book of Acts, Peter and Paul and others, what evidence did they use to prove that Jesus was the Son of God? He was the Christ. He was the great prophet of God. And we'll compare those bodies of evidence tomorrow. But whoever asked this, you're driving at the very heart of the matter. There were no witnesses. Okay? There were none. Does the invention of the printing press have much to do with the expansion of European growth and decline of Muslim influence, political, religious, society, education, etc.? Yes. That was part of the growth of European technology that spread European ideas and European influence. The printing press was a technological advancement that put Europe more in the driver's seat. Now, the movable type, the Chinese invented the printing press. But Gutenberg developed the movable type, where you could more efficiently and cheaply print printed materials. In other words, you could change out the type, and it made it more efficient and more economical. So, yes, That was very significant. Haven't read this one yet. I just handed it. If Muslims don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, what does it mean to them that Jesus was the Messiah? Was he viewed as greater than the prophets before him? Great question. They believe that Messiah means the one prophesied in the Old Testament to be a great teacher and a great leader and even provide the way back to God. That's as far as their definition of Messiah went. Now understand, wasn't that an issue in the days of Jesus? Just what is the Messiah? Is he a political ruler? Is he a deliverer from Roman oppression? Is he merely a teacher? And a lot of people in Jesus' day had difficulty accepting that Messiah also meant Son of God. And wasn't that the thing that got Jesus killed? At the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the fact that he admitted that he was the Son of God, that's the thing that they just couldn't accept that. And so they would have a view of the Messiah that said that he would be a great teacher and a great leader, but not the Son of God. That's their definition of a Messiah. And so in that way, Jesus fulfilled that prediction. And so, they're not unique to that. A lot of people have thought that. A lot of people in our day. You ask the average person who doesn't accept the Bible as the Word of God who Jesus was. I think he was a great teacher. Okay? So, that's not an uncommon belief. It really is not. It's maybe commonplace. So that's how they would respond to that. Will you be discussing the 12ers? I assume what that means, the 12 wives of Muhammad. Muhammad only had one wife, Khadijah, the one we talked about last night, until she died. And after she died, he added other wives. He had 11 more wives. The Quran allows 4 wives if you can provide for each of them equally. So you don't add another one unless you can provide for her as you did the first one. Polygamy is, though, not incredibly common even in the Muslim world. It happens. And it does occur in certain Middle Eastern cultures and even African cultures that's affected by Islam. And some that are not affected by Islam. But polygamy has just sort of, faded a little bit culturally. But it is allowed in the Quran, multiple wives. And the wives that he took were based upon 2 criteria. Alliances with tribes that he was trying to bring under his influence. Does that remind you of Solomon in the Old Testament? And then he also took women whose husbands had died in battle for the Islamic cause. And because they were widows and were in need, he took them to provide for them. Does that remind you of David and Abigail a little bit? We talked about that last night. Arlene and I were talking about that. The thing about multiple wives, if somebody wants to make a big case about that with Muhammad, somebody can have that discussion, but then we got to have it about Abraham, we got to have it about David, we got to have it about Solomon. And do we want to go there? I just don't think that's an issue that's germane. Those things happen in the Old Testament. Not everything was what it ought to be in the Old Testament. Not everybody was following the will of God in the Old Testament, and there were changes from the Old Testament to the New Testament. That's how we answer that, okay? So, got another one? Right over here. Then we'll take some from the floor. If the Bible is fundamentally not tolerant of Islam, in Galatians 1, 8, and 9, about rejecting another gospel, and Christ was constantly passing judgment on those steeped in their religion, how do we get from let them be accursed to being tolerant of their false religion? We love them, for we know that while we are lost, Christ died for us. Should not we be tolerant with the lostness, not their religion? Yes. I agree with that. That the Bible's teaching is counter to teaching of Islam. The New Testament's teaching is counter to Islam. Those last points we made about Christ, his death, his resurrection, him being the Son of God, there is no way to reconcile the two. It is a different gospel. Islam is a different teaching about how to be saved. It is not the same thing as Christianity. You cannot accept both. It's one or the other. And I think the question tries to make the distinction between accepting their religion and showing respect and concern about people. And I think that's exactly right. Did Paul agree with the Athenian philosophers? Did he think, well, I'm a Christian, but, you guys are polytheists and, That's who you are, and that's fine with me, and everything's okay. We'll all end up in the same place. Paul didn't think that. If he thought that, he wouldn't be trying to preach to him as he was. But yet, he was reaching out. He wanted to open a dialogue. He understood where they were coming from, and he was trying to get them to see the truth of Jesus Christ and the truth of the one true God. And so I think that is an important distinction to make there. Okay? All right. I want to throw some things out to you, and then you can be thinking of a question, and we'll take a couple of more questions from the floor. But I think this is important. It's a good time to throw some of this in, and this might address even the question that you have. Population statistics are tricky. They're never exactly right, okay? There's nobody going around with one of those little things clicking, counting people. People are moving too fast. You can't do that. But 1.57 billion Muslims in the world. There's about 6 billion people in the world. That's about 22% of the world population. It's often said that Islam is one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing religions of the world. Probably so. But there's another question. Why? People say that and then they make a lot of conclusions. Why? Well, it has to do with reproduction, not conversion. Key factor in this is that Muslim countries are among the fastest growing in population. These darker colors indicate higher birth rates in the world. Lighter colors, lower birth rates. And if you look at the area that is heavily Islamic, across North Africa into southern Asia, as you can see, the darker green is the higher percentage of Islamic people. So here's the correlation. Why there is an increasing amount of Muslims in the world? Because Muslim countries have high birth rates. That's why. It's not that Muslims are going into areas where there are all these Christians or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists and converting them to Islam. No. Very little of that's happening in the world. Very little. But adherence to the religion of Islam is, growing because of reproduction. It's very much a cultural thing. Does that make sense? Does, doesn't it? Okay. This is an interesting list. The most populous Muslim countries. In other words, countries that have the most Muslims in them. Number 1, Indonesia. This chain of islands down here in the South Pacific off the eastern coast of Asia. This is the area that had the tsunami a couple of years ago. There are more Muslims that live in Indonesia than any other part of the world. It's an Asian culture. And it got there through trade, not military conquest. After the Arab Islamic civilization settled in the Middle East, it began to take up trade with the Far East, and there was a lot of interaction, and Islam really took root in Indonesia and grew. A lot of Indonesians in America who have a Muslim background. Okay, India. India is a fascinating story. A lot of people in India. It will probably surpass China in population as the most populous nation in the world here in about 15 years, maybe sooner. But India is predominantly Hindu, but has a large Muslim population. And they have clashed through time. And that's why when India got its independence from Britain in the 1840s, India sectioned off right here Bangladesh and Pakistan as Muslim territories. And Bangladesh and Pakistan became their own nations, and Muslims were to migrate to those areas. A lot of Muslims did. And so Bangladesh and Pakistan are predominantly Islamic. However, people don't like to leave home, right? A lot of Muslims in India stayed in India. And so it's still a lot of Muslims in India, and because there's so many Indians, it's the second amount. Third, Pakistan. 4, Bangladesh. 5, the Central Republics, just lumped in together. Those, Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan from the former Soviet Union. 6, China. You don't think of China being Islamic, but especially in the western part of China, more rural part of China, there are many, many Muslims. Islam had spread up into that area. Now, most Chinese are not Muslim. Most Chinese aren't anything religiously. But most Chinese are not Muslim. Muslims are a minority in China. But because China has so many people, that's a lot of people. When you're a minority and you got 1 billion people, you still have a lot of folks there. And so look at this list. What's missing? No Middle East country. There is not one Middle East country. Why? Because these countries actually have more Muslims in them. But then you start to see the rest of the list. Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Nigeria, and then Africa there. But it's quite interesting. But the part of the world that I guess you could say stirs up the most dust regarding, religious differences and so forth is in the Middle East. But really, there are more Muslims that live in other sections of the world. This is really elusive. How many Muslims are in America? You can't determine this. I've looked and I've looked and I've looked. According to Muslim sources, it could be as high as 6 million people. And no doubt it's underreported. In the recent 2010 census, come on. People are not going to disclose that necessarily on the census form. And in a way, I don't know if I would blame them. Fear of retaliation or something like that, I suppose. But according to social scientists, it's probably in the range of about 2 million people in America. And we have, 300 million in America. So, and again, most of this is immigration. It's not conversion. It's immigration. I think it depends on the census that you get. Is that right? Anybody work for the census last summer? Okay. There are longer and shorter ones. Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay. Okay. All right. You have something, and we'll start taking.
Someone wants to look up online. It's the Pew Forum.
That's a good source.
Growth. Their latest survey and information out there is, like you said, there's about 0.8% in the U.S. are Muslim.
0.8.
And they're saying that over the next 20 years, the population of Muslims in our country will double, which will make it all the way up to about 1.6%. So, the fears of, Muslim takeover of the country are greatly exaggerated from that standpoint. Like you said, mostly because of immigration and also reproduction.
Yeah.
But even in that, Muslim birth rates are coming down. They're still the highest in the world, but they are coming down.
Yeah. Great.
They're higher than America's birth rate is about 0.6.
Yeah.
Muslims 1.6.
Right.
So they're increasing that.
Right. Great. And that is a great source. Pew Resource. Pew Center for, it's PEW. It's very good, very accurate. That's a great point. It's still a minority. And even those growing in America, it's through immigration and reproduction. Okay, questions? Yes?
Based on what evidence are Muslims able to substantiate their claim that the Bible manuscripts are now flawed from the originals?
Good question. I think that the conclusion that the biblical manuscripts are flawed is based upon the Quran. That the Quran talks about Abraham offering Ishmael. They believe in the Quran, thus the Genesis account must have been corrupted. I have not seen really hard evidence from, limitation here. Maybe there's something that would pop up that the case is made that this happened and these manuscripts were corrupted. It's more of a backing up from the Quran that the Quran says Jesus didn't die. So when the book of Matthew and Luke and Mark and John talk about the death of Jesus, they have it mistaken. Okay? Arlen?
There's a discussion between the Allah of Islam and the God of Christian are not the same entity. What kind of discussion?
Yeah, good question. They're all good questions. Let's just say that. I guess there's two answers to that. If somebody says, I believe in one God, there's only one God, He's the creator, He's the revealer of all truth, and the Greeks called God Theos. So, there are different names based on your language. That's understandable. And so Allah being an Arabic term. So if they mean the one true God, and we call Him Allah, if that's their word for Him, that's understandable. However, if you go deeper and you say, okay, who is Allah? Well, He's the one that chose Muhammad as His seal of the prophets. Okay, He's the one that's revealed this and revealed that, the Quran and so forth, and He's the one that sent Jesus, but Jesus didn't die, versus the God of the Bible, who Abraham was chosen, Isaac was the selected son of promise, Jesus died on the cross. That's two different versions of the God. Okay, that's two different versions of the true and living God. So in that sense, the God of the Bible and the God of the Allah of Islam is different. because of what he's done through history. How you define who somebody is? What they say and what they do, right? So what God has said and done in Islam is different than what God has said and done in the Bible. So that's different. Yes, sir.
Are there structures within Islam? I understand that, like in Shia, they had I believe he's in Iraq. Do you have those other head hymns?
It's not very structured. It's not very organized. Islam is not. What happens through time. Now, early on, okay, after about 20 years, passing the death of Muhammad, there developed some dynasties. Okay, Umayyad was a dynasty, and one dynasty was based in Syria, and then one was based in Baghdad, in Iraq. And these became politically the dominant authority structures who also safeguarded the religion. So they had a unified central government, so to speak. Okay? Since those dynasties waned, there has not really been any kind of unity across Islam worldwide at all. There have been times when a certain imam rises up and has a lot of influence, and his writings are read by a lot of people, or some Muslim scholar has a lot of influence in a certain location. But there's not been, really in Shia or Sunni Islam, any kind of real organized structure. And there is this notion among some Shia Muslims, some are more, I guess you could say, extreme than others, that there is this continuing inner light in a certain amount of Muslim teachers. And they believe in certain ones come up and, he's got that inner light just like Muhammad had. But that's even disputed. And so it's very how can I say, it's just the opposite of Roman Catholicism in many ways as far as its structure. Roman Catholicism is very centralized, and Islam is not. Pardon?
What do they call them? Madrasas? I believe the Saudi government.
Schools.
Yeah, so I mean, they can have their own interpretation of it.
True. That's true. Yeah. And certain teachers get influence. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Go right ahead.
I want to follow up on Arden's question about whether God and Allah are the same. And I've heard two gentlemen who grew up in Muslim countries and what have you, converted, who teach that Islam is a deception, that it's a counterfeit created by our enemy, the devil, to enslave millions of people. And so where I'm going with this is I'm trying to introduce it well. The Quran refers to Allah as the best deceiver and as the Lord of the world, which are descriptions in the Bible for the devil. And when we hear about how Muhammad received his revelations, he would go into what in the Bible was described as demonic possession, seizures and foaming at the mouth. He was always afraid
They were trances.
of the appearance
They were.
of angels, where angels in the Bible always say fear not. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering where you've encountered in your study.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just have to limit myself to recorded history and writings of records of events and what teachers say on every side of this, and how to figure out if Muhammad is not a prophet and Quran is not from divine origin, where does it come from? That's a toughie, okay? And if there's a similarity to Joseph Smith and Mormonism. If Joseph Smith is not a prophet of God, where did those plates come from? And where did that Book of Mormon come from? And I don't know how to address that. It's like, by the way, I'm in my house and this happened to me in my house, and you come and tell me what happened in your house. I don't know what happened in your house. I wasn't there. I only have your word for it. And it could be something I can't believe, or it can be something believable. And we'll talk about that tomorrow afternoon. We talk about Jesus and Muhammad. And I just can't go there answering, well, this is really what's happened. Because if regarding false religions and false teachers, how they're used by Satan and all that, we're just not privy to that. We know that Satan walks about like a roaring lion. He is deceitful. There are angels of light that he uses. Beyond that, it's hard to exactly get detailed. We can have speculation, but I just struggle with what else to do with that.
But Allah and God, as we answer Arden's
Yeah.
question, can't be the same if they're doing and saying different things.
I think that's the key, okay? Allah is saying and doing this. God of the Bible is saying and doing this. That's not the same thing. So, Rufus.
In your
Wasn't that good? I called you Rufus.
Yes, thank you. In your studies over the years, where does the Nation of Islam fit in
Yeah.
to this?
Yeah. That's good, and it's important that comes up. Nation of Islam, in quotation marks, is a religious slash political slash social movement that emerged in the mid-20th century, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And there were those in the Civil Rights Movement who believed that the mainstream Civil Rights Movement, whose face was Dr. King, was not aggressive enough. They also didn't like the idea of a black person embracing Christianity. They thought that Christianity was a white man's religion imposed upon African Americans. They believed that a truer religion for African Americans was Islam. Okay? So the Nation of Islam was formed in the mid-20th century, and Elijah Muhammad, you may have heard of his name, as well as Malcolm X, which is even more well known, were adherents to the Nation of Islam and early leaders in the Nation of Islam. And in its religious personality, that organization claims to embrace the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad. However, it's more than just a manifestation of the religion of Islam. It also had a political agenda working for really not so much equal rights, but it was more what is called sometimes the Black Power movement. Okay? It's categorized that historically. That the Nation of Islam didn't believe that American society would give blacks an equal status in society. And so it was an advocacy group to defend black citizens in America of their rights. Instead of appealing to the government to protect them, like Dr. King was trying to get laws passed and things like that, protests and other people like that. They were even not trying much to appeal to the law. They were just trying to build an organization that would protect black people, and their rights. Okay? And so it became a sort of radicalized Black Power movement with the religion of Islam wrapped around it. General mainstream Islam does not have anything to do with it. Okay? It does not have anything to do with it. And it was one of the responses to the abuses of the American system at the time, the inequality. But it was a response that used Islam as its religious base. Dr. King appealed to the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? He appealed to the teachings of Jesus. Everybody's, treat each other as brothers. And they appealed to, Muhammad. So that's it. It's a fascinating thing. It's very robust in the 50s and 60s, and then it weakened. It's still alive today. And you've heard of Louis Farrakhan. He's the face of it today. Yes, ma'am, right here.
What was the distance of time between the Hadith and the Sharia law? How much time?
Good question. Around the same time, and Sharia came very slowly. How is civil law written? Well, guess what? Our civil law is still being written. They're called congressmen. We elect them, we send them up there, and they write laws. So civil law has constantly been written. Okay? So Sharia law happened over a long period of time, but it was, once they got an empire, they had to rule it. So they had to develop a civil law about marriage and land contracts and business deals and lawsuits and all that kind of thing. But they want to reflect Islamic belief. And so it occurred a long time after Muhammad, around the time of the Hadith. You're looking at a couple hundred years. Yeah.
Then the other question, you had a question only about the 12ers. The 12ers refer to the 12 Imams.
Oh, okay.
And repeat the question, Phil.
Yeah, the 12ers, somebody, was that yours?
No.
Okay, the 12ers may be the 12 Imams, okay? The first, okay. I tell you, I don't know a whole lot about that. Okay, there are some beliefs among some Islamic people that there are imams to come that will rise up and restore purity of Islam and lead Islam into a great glorious period. Okay, and that's not different than some people who claim to be Christian, who predict things about the end of the world and prophets that will rise up and things like that. So I really don't know a whole lot about it. I'm really more versed in historic Islam. not current Islamic trends. I just don't know a whole lot about that. So what else is out? I don't know. Back here, this gentleman.
Could Muhammad himself read and write?
Yeah, good question. Muslim people say that Muhammad was functionally illiterate, that he was not able to fully read and write. He was very limited in that. And they cite that as proof that he must have been guided by God to be able to give all these revelations. However, he worked in his uncle's caravan trade business. He kept books. There was literacy in that society. And the argument I've seen made by objective, scholars is that there's evidence that he could read and write. Besides that, functional illiteracy, isn't that a degree? A lot of people write and read better than I do. But I think I read and write. And so there's a relative measurement there. But they cite that as evidence. He couldn't really read and write very well, so how could he produce this? This must be of God. That's the argument. But there's some evidence that he spoke and wrote functionally. Okay, there was one right here. Yes, ma'am, right here.
If Islam rejects the core beliefs of Christianity, how do you make the case to someone who is Muslim?
Yeah, really, that's what we're going to do in those last two lessons tomorrow. And I think those are the critical issues. There's all kinds of fascinating questions that come up and interesting things like the 12 verse and so forth. But the two big issues have to do with, is Muhammad a prophet of God, and is the Quran from God? What's the evidence? And so, same thing with Jesus in the Bible. And so what I'm going to do tomorrow is summarize those arguments and make the case for Jesus in the Bible. And so I think that the things that I emphasize tomorrow are the things you need to emphasize. And that is, where's the evidence, and present the evidence that Jesus is the Son of God, and here's the evidence the Bible is believable. And I think a lot of it has to do with Messianic prophecy and the miracles of Jesus. Okay, over here.
What does the Quran actually teach on martyrdom?
Yeah, there is a section in the Quran, and I won't talk about this tomorrow afternoon. Okay, this is not a cop-out. I am going to talk about this. I want to talk about this tomorrow afternoon and show the quote from the Quran about fighting and war and things like that. That there are some statements in the Quran at a certain time that if you died, that you are blessed with paradise. Okay? But the vast majority of Muslims would say that's only in a certain situation. Radical Islamic terrorists would say it's any time you can kill an American. Okay? So there's a variety there. I want to liken something, okay, parallel something, and we talked about this last night. I do think there's a parallel between radical Islamic terrorists who believe in taking up arms and using violence to kill those who are who they believe to be enemies to Islam. There's a parallel between radical Islamic terrorists and Islam and Christianity and those who claim to be Christian and who bomb abortion clinics. I believe abortion is wrong. I believe it's a taking of a life. That's a human life. It's a taking of it. That's wrong. Completely believe that. This room probably has a lot of people in here that believe the same thing. But there's no way that belief would anywhere endorse me killing an abortion doctor or blowing up a clinic. Because, duh, that's taking a life, okay? And so there is a parallel to those in Islam who are radical terrorists who believe in all these violent, awful acts. And they are an extreme minority. And those generally in Islam and who are Muslims who would not think that that's proper at all. They think that's wrong. And if you have conversations with living and breathing Muslims, and 9/11 comes up or something like that comes up, you'll see the disgust on their face. They're troubled. They're troubled by it. Because that's the worst PR they could ever get. How do you feel when you hear about abortion clinic being bombed? What's the feeling you get? That's the feeling they got on 9/11. And we're going to talk tomorrow's lesson more about the role of force in Islamic culture, when it's allowed and so forth. And we're going to talk more about that. Okay. Yeah, one more.
I'm going to let that go since you just said you're going to talk about that tomorrow. But the guaranteed paradise. Not like we know that if we accept Jesus and
Right.
have you,
Assurance.
we say, yeah, we have assurance, yeah.
I think there is, from what I've read. What I've seen is that if you are a devout Muslim and believe in Muhammad being his prophet, and there's one God, no God but Allah, and you practice the 5 pillars, I do think there is assurance statements in there.
So it's kind of like the following of the law, but the thing is how many people really can follow it that faithfully and be assured, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Is it a salvation based upon faith and grace, or salvation based upon law? And a lot of Christians want to try to make it out to be a system based on law, okay, and go to Romans and say you're not justified by the law. I think there's some points to make on that with Islam. But I don't really think that's the heart of the problem and the difference. The heart of the problem is Jesus, what they believe about Jesus. That's really the heart of the problem. And whether it's a system based on law or grace, I think that's a challenging one for me. I think the case can be made it is based on law.
Yeah, because I guess my question would be, why would I want to convert to Islam if I have no guarantee that I'm going to wind up in
Yeah.
paradise?
Well, there are statements of assurance. Yeah, there are statements of assurance, but what's that assurance based on? I think that we've hit the mark. Thank you all very much, and I'll turn it over to Bob.